What you need to know before the auditors ask. Take it away, Liz.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you, and welcome everyone. A lot of times people don't like to talk about auditors or deal with auditors or anything like that, but like it or not, they are going to be paying us visits. If they're not already in your offices, they'll probably start coming soon. And there's lots of different areas that they like to look at and poke around and take stock of within Dynamics GP. And so we're going to talk about those areas and how best to prepare for your auditors, because being proactive when it comes to auditors is a heck of a lot better than being reactive. So we're going to try to get you prepared as best as we can for them. So a little bit about me. I am certified in risk and information systems control. I have about 20 years of experience in financial management systems. I am a GP end user. I was a GP consultant, and now I'm in the ISV channel, focusing on audit, security, and compliance. So basically, auditors want to know that administrators understand and have control of their system. So that's what we're going to talk about today, how to get those auditors believing that we have control of our system. Okay, so our agenda is we're going to define security and controls first off. What does that mean exactly, and what are we going to take a look at? And then within security and controls, we're going to talk about segregation of duties, user security, different administrative type of users within GP, orphaned users, and some process controls. And then lastly, we're going to talk about end-of-year journal entries, because what I want to do is I want to focus on those areas where the auditors are going to be looking, where they're going to be focusing their magnifying glasses. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. So what are security and controls? Security basically refers to the features around your user application permissions, and controls refer to the process controls within the application itself, but also external to the application. So for example, security are your roles and your permissions that you give to GP. Your controls could be part of that security setup, but it could also be things like using safe pay, audit trail, different types of controls, maybe some workflow, things where you're having an approval process, etc. So the goal is an environment that uses a blend of security and control measures to mitigate risks that are operational or financial in nature, right? So today we're really going to focus on operational and financial risks, things that center around your Dynamics GP system, right? We're not going to focus on risks that can happen, such as, environmental risks or things like that, because those are really out of our control and really not a focus for today. We're really going to focus about things that are in our system and what we can do. And why is it important? Security and controls are important because it will mitigate fraud and malicious activity. Now, this isn't to say that in every organization there's fraud and malicious activity. There hopefully is not, but unfortunately there is as well, and so we want to go ahead and mitigate the risk from that. When you give users access to your systems, within that access you are opening your organization up to a little bit of risk, right? So we want to mitigate that risk, we want to control that risk, minimize that risk as much as possible. It's also important because we want to make sure that management decisions are based on accurate information. You know, when we talk about year-end reporting or even any type of reporting through the year, if we don't have good controls around our system, who's to say that the reports that are generated outside of the system are accurate? What if they can be fudged? What if things can be kind of moved around to make reports look better, right? So if we have control over our systems, there's less chance of that. And so when we're making decisions based on these reports that we're getting out of our system, we're making them based on accurate information. Security and controls can actually achieve process efficiency. It can help transform manual processes into automated controls. For example, you could use security and controls to put in some better systems in place, like workflow, where if you're entering some information in into the system and then it's going through a workflow process to get approved, at the end, at the approval point, it might automatically be committed to the system as a record, whereas before, maybe you were taking that information and manually putting it into an email to somebody, asking them to approve it, that email was going back, and then you'd have to manually key that information back into GP or something like that, right? So we can actually achieve controls with security and controls. It increases management confidence. So going back to making decisions based on accurate information, if management is confident in the security setup around the tool, they're going to be more confident in the reports and information that are coming, that's coming out of the tool. And then finally, it helps fulfill compliance requirements for both internal and external auditors. Now, not everybody on this call is a publicly traded entity, so you might not have to be SOX compliant per se, but I'm sure there's probably plenty of internal requirements in terms of safekeeping assets and making sure that the system is compliant and user security is compliant, etc. So that's why these security and controls are important, and that's why we're going to talk about them today. So these are just some things that we see at our clients, and again, more reasons why it's important to take a look at our security and controls environment, our setup, who's accessing our system, the different administrative access that we can grant, because a lot of times it tends to be forgotten. So for example, once you implement an ERP, let's say you're first installing Dynamics GP, or maybe you guys have been longtime Dynamics GP users. Either way, probably when the system was originally being set up, access security was low priority for whoever was setting up the system, right? Just because when you're setting up a new ERP, you need to make sure that you guys can work, that you can get your transactions processed, that you can get your vendors paid, that you can get your cash received for goods that are being sold, that you can get goods sold and shipped, etc., right? So at that point, are you really worried about security so much, or as you are worrying about actually doing your job, making money, closing your books, etc.? Probably not. You don't take process controls into part of the consideration, so sometimes security is built without thinking about things like workflow or other items that can help. So maybe sometimes security can be too stringent instead of a little bit looser, but putting some different controls around that security. And other things that we see is security is the domain of IT or system administrators and not the business process owners. And that becomes a huge problem, because how many people are sitting in the IT department right now that know exactly what's going on in the day-to-day processes of the organization, what's happening on the payable side, what's happening on the receivable side, what's happening in the purchasing department, or what's happening in the sales and shipping departments? Probably not a lot. I mean, maybe there's some high-level understanding of what's happening, but they're not really understanding the day-to-day processes, and so they might not want to they might not set up security in the best way. There's no ongoing monitoring of process controls. So basically, they kind of set things up at the beginning, and then no one's going back and looking at these processing, seeing if the process has changed at all as the business has grown and matured and developed. Are you doing things differently now than when you first implemented GP? And if so, have you looked at your security in terms of how you're doing things differently? So probably not. No consideration for segregation of duties. Okay, so when you set up security, you're not thinking, hey, you know what, this could be a potential conflict. I'm giving somebody too much access. This user can actually, create a vendor, pay the vendor, create the invoice, void the invoice, and then even do the deletion of paid invoices. So, and they might even have access to journal entry. So effectively, they could cut a check from the system and then make the whole transaction disappear, right? So not thinking about that kind of stuff as they're setting up security and controls. Dilution of go-live security design. Maybe you had excellent security setup when you first implemented GP years ago, or maybe just recently, depends on how long you were using GP. But I can guarantee that there's a couple of people sitting on the phone where the process of adding a new user to GP goes something like, hey, John needs access to GP. He's going to be working with Cindy and her department handling payables. Can we set him up with access? Sure. What do we need to give him? And instead of saying, well, he needs access to these companies and these roles, and this is what his tasks are going to be, we're going to say, oh, we'll give him the same security as Jane. He's going to be taking over Jane's duties. Well, what did Jane have access to? I don't know. When she came on board, she was given the same access as Tony. Well, what does Tony have access to? I don't know, because when Tony came on board, he was given the same access as Steve, and Steve's been here for 20 years and he's sitting in the basement with his red stapler. So nobody knows anything about what people are actually getting access to in the system. And if that's a process that happens in your organization right now, today, I would suggest that you guys take some notes down about potentially calling your friends at InterDyn and saying, hey guys, we have a little bit of a problem. We probably need to take a look at our security and maybe do some revamping of how we provision users in our organization. Okay. Another issue that we see is inability to report on the security setup. How many of you have spent hours tearing out your hair looking at GP security reports, trying to make heads or tails out of what's coming out of that system, trying to understand exactly what sales transaction entry zoom window means and what it actually does? GP security reporting is maddening, and you would think that GP is now a very mature tool. We're on version 2016, and I started way back in version 5. I'm sure some of you have started earlier. I won't name names, but I bet you that there's a couple that have been on even earlier versions, and security reporting hasn't gotten any better. A little bit, maybe, tiny bit, but not much, and so it's very difficult. And so we need to find ways to make that reporting better, to make it easier to really understand what we're granting access to in our system. And then the last thing that we see are expensive customizations are built instead of security and controls features. For example, I've seen things where users need to see the vendor card because the vendor inquiry window is basically not as comprehensive as the vendor maintenance window. Right? It doesn't give you all of the different fields, and people in the purchasing department don't need to actually change the vendor, but they need more information from the vendor maintenance window. And so instead of maybe building a report where they can quickly do a query, or maybe using a smart list and locking it down so they can just put in a vendor ID in the smart list feature, and pull out the information that they need from that vendor card. I've seen an organization do stuff like they do VB code to disable the save button, so the users can actually go in and pull up the vendor maintenance window, but they can't make any changes to it because they can't hit save. And that's fine until you go and upgrade, and then you realize that that VB code is broken and you have to rebuild it, etc. And that starts to cost money by the time you call in your developers to make those changes, etc. Right? So we just want to make note that sometimes customizations aren't always a good choice. Sometimes they're your only choice. We're not saying that that they're all bad, but sometimes they're not the best choice. So make sure that you explore all avenues rather than starting to build customizations right from the get-go. Okay, so that's just a little introduction to security and controls, and then in talking about security and controls and moving over into the segregation of duties, we have to discuss how we identify risk in an organization. Every organization faces risk of some kind, from the tiny little 2-person organization, Bob's Bait and Tackle, to the huge multinational, thousands of employee organizations, right? Every business has faced risk. So you have to define what your risk tolerance is. What are your riskiest areas, okay, and what your tolerance or appetite for risk is. Maybe you're more a risk-averse organization. You're small, you don't have a lot of capital, so you have to be pretty conservative. Maybe you're quite large and you have tons of capital and funds to play with, and so maybe you're a little bit more risk tolerant and less risk averse, etc. So you have to kind of define that. And processes are going to vary by industry, season, geography, company size, number of employees, etc. And like I said, every company is going to have different risk. For example, I always use the example of Heineken versus Dice, right? Heineken is this multinational beer manufacturer and distributor, and so their risk is based a lot around their inventory, transportation, storage, and physical product. They can have loss by theft, breakage, spoilage, etc. Whereas DICE is a website where people can go and post jobs, or people can go and look for jobs. So there's nobody sitting in a warehouse at DICE pulling jobs off of a rack and then putting them onto the rack in the warehouse, right? It's a completely different process. So their risk areas are more about accounts receivable, accounts payable. They probably have a lot of PCI compliance issues because they're probably accepting a ton of credit card payments from advertisers and job advertisers and things like that. So their risk profile is completely different. So you have to identify and understand your risk profile as an organization. So then once you do that, you want to talk about segregation of duties, okay, and how you best segregate duties within the organization. And what we mean by that is how we can achieve the least amount of overlapping of sensitive duties as possible without really having to hire one person to press one button all day long, because that is, we understand that that is completely impractical in an organization, okay? There is going to be some overlap, it's understood, but what you have to do is you have to understand where that overlap is acceptable and where it isn't. So the first part of segregation of duties is that excessive user access creates risk of errors, fraud, and misstatements, right? Anytime that a user has way too much access, they can do some serious damage to your system. So how do you figure out where your segregation of duties issues are? Well, the first thing that you need to do is build a set of potential conflicts. And what we mean by conflict is those overlapping access rights. For example, I can create a vendor and I can pay a vendor. That's a conflict. I can open and close a fiscal period and I can create a journal entry. Conflict. I might be able to post entries to close periods and misstate prior year financial statements, which is a big, big no, unless my auditors have asked me to do that, right? So those are the types of conflicts you want to be looking for. So once you've made your list of potential conflicts, then you need to identify which users have those conflicts. Okay, and in some instances it's okay for the user to have those conflicts, and in other instances it's really not okay. For example, if I have an AP clerk and I'm looking at their access and I see that they have access to create a vendor and create a payment term, technically that's a risk, because let's say we have a 30-day vendor payment policy. We pay our vendors every 30 days regardless, and all of a sudden they make a shift to paying this vendor in 7 days, because if this vendor gets paid every 7 days, an extra box of product shows up on the processor's doorstep. Well, you know, that could be a problem. But we can maybe find ways around without removing access. If that user really needs that access, maybe we can do some auditing there to see that that's not happening. But that same user I see also has access to fiscal period setup and journal entries, and it's like, well, wait a second. This AP processor does not need access to these GL features at all. So let's go back and make the change to the security and set up that security appropriately so that they're not going in and making financial transactions that could really be detrimental, right? So we have to identify those conflicts. And then whatever is left where we can't remove security access rights, right? Because again, I told you it's a balance. We're not going to be a zero conflict environment. Nobody is going to have a zero conflict environment. Most organizations can't have one person doing just one task all day long. So the biggest key is once you've identified the acceptable conflicts, or the ones that are necessary, what's your mitigation? What's your rule? What's your control? What are you doing about it? Okay? What are you doing about that risk? So Maybe you have an audit trail tool in place to track when changes are made to sensitive data. Maybe you're tracking who's opening and closing fiscal periods so entries can't be posted to prior periods. Maybe you're tracking when vendors are created or changed so you can take note if check names are being changed inappropriately. Maybe you're tracking customer changes to see that credit limits aren't being set up, above an appropriate threshold, etc. Maybe you're using things like positive pay to identify checks once they're at the bank so that they cannot be changed between the time that they leave your system and the time that they're actually cashed in the bank, or they will be rejected by the bank. Things like that. So there's all sorts of control policies, and what you can do, just have to understand what it is that you're doing about it, and you want to document that because that's what your auditors are going to be looking for. If you have your auditors spend time doing this process for you, you're going to be paying out the nose to your auditors. Okay, so these are things that you need to start taking a look at in-house, because the more confidence you give your auditors that you're actually examining these areas and you're looking at these areas, the less time they're going to spend doing this type of investigation. And remember, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, with auditors, it's always best to be proactive rather than reactive. Proactive saves you money, reactive costs you money. Now, one thing to note, this is really hard and time-consuming to get right with just native GP tools. You can, it's just a little bit more difficult. You might want to consider a third-party option if that's feasible for your organization. We're not saying that you have to, just a consideration to take. But definitely, regardless if you choose a third party or if you invest the time to kind of do it yourself with just using native GP security reports, please take a look at your security setup and where you have your potential conflicts. This will save you a lot of headache down the road. Okay, so that's a little bit about segregation of duties. User security. So we're going to talk about different types of user security. We're going to talk about power users and SA and all the administrative access and things like that. So basically, the things that you want to take note of, especially around year-end, is do you have a good documentation of your user security and how it's changing throughout the year? Do you have a good understanding of who can do what? Okay. Do you have a good log of when users were set up, when their access has been changed, when users have been removed, things like that, because this is a common audit area. Auditors will come in and spend at least a little bit of time poking around your user security. Okay, so this is where you want to spend a little time really getting an understanding of who has access to your systems. Run a GP user list. When's the last time you took a look at your GP user list? How many users are on that list that don't actually even work for the organization anymore? That's something that you might want to take a look at. If there are users on that list that are no longer with the organization, disable or delete them, please. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on with orphaned users, but take a look at your GP security list. If there are users on there that are still with the company but they've never touched GP, what kind of security do they have? Do they just have an inquiry type role, or are they a power user? Is everybody in your organization a power user? Okay, and I've seen that. I've seen organizations where they just didn't spend the time to set up security. They just made everybody a power user. They're certainly asking for issues later on down the road, but you know, that's something that you might want to take a look at. Now, GP does offer some security reports. You do want to remember that GP access reports are missing SA users and power users. SA is never going to show up on an access report, so you have to remember everybody that knows that SA password in your organization has the keys to the kingdom. Okay, they have access to everything. And then power users also have keys to the kingdom, a little bit of limitation in terms of what they have, what they don't have versus what SA has is they don't have access to the databases at a SQL level, in terms of they can't log into SQL Query Analyzer and drop tables or run update statements and things like that, but they do have the keys to the kingdom within GP. Okay, and they will not show up on an access report. So make sure if you're ever running a security access report for an auditor that you also attach a list of who your power users are. okay? Because auditors want to know that you understand how your security is being set up and that you're reviewing this regularly, okay? They are going to be nitpicky about this area. And if they haven't really been nitpicky about this yet, consider yourselves lucky. Because obviously, if if you have very loose access to your system, your potential for fraud or misstatement increases exponentially rather than a system that is more tightly held down. Okay. System administrator, so SA. Everybody loves SA. SA is tough because there are still some areas, specifically in, I would say, with ISVs or third-party products, where they potentially require you to use SA for a specific task or permission or function within that. Dynamics GP itself, starting with version 2013, I believe, does not require you to log into GP as SA to do anything, not even create users. You do not need to be SA to create users. Okay? The problem with SA is it's an anonymous user. 7 different people could have the SA user ID and password. How are you going to know which of those 7 actually went into the system to do something? It's almost impossible to tie back to a specific user if you have multiple people that know that password. It gives excessive permission. Again, with SA, not only can you log into GP from the application itself, you can go to SQL Query Analyzer and access all of the databases. It doesn't show in user permission reports. Now, if you're an organization that is still highly dependent on SA, okay, we do have a blog paper out there, PDF white paper, and it's called Minimizing the Use of SA in Dynamics GP. It is free to anyone to go out there and download it. So if this is something that you guys need to do in your organization, you need to make some changes, you really, really need to minimize who has access to SA, this is a good resource. So go out and download it and pass it along to maybe your IT staff or other people in your organization that might need to read this, because you don't necessarily have to depend on SA, especially for anything Dynamics GP specific. Okay, but if you do have to use SA, okay, if there's no getting around it, if there's a specific reason for SA to be out there, the very first thing is obviously carefully guard that password. I have seen instances where the password is actually split in 2 and one person has one half and the other person has the other half, and they both have to be together to enter it into the system. Things like that. Seen some very creative things, but carefully guard that password. Temporarily change the password. So if you're doing an upgrade, maybe after you're done with the upgrade, change the password. Or if you've given your SA user ID to your consultants, change the password. And that's another thing. Your consultants don't necessarily need SA access to your system. Okay, so just be careful with that. Have an understanding of why. Don't be afraid to challenge people. If they say, I need SA, ask why. What do you need SA for? Well, I need to create 4 new users. Don't need to be SA to create 4 new users. We'll give you the appropriate access. So whatever it is, challenge them. Okay, ask specifically why they need to use SA. And then finally, do not use SA for service accounts or other connections. Things like you don't want to use SA as a service account when you're running an eConnect routine to update information in GP from another source. Things like that. Because then you are tied to keeping that password unless you break all of those connections. And then, because what happens is you set up an eConnect service routine, let's say today, and it's running for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, you forget about it. Or maybe the person that set it up is no longer with the organization or whatever. No one realizes that that's built using SA as the account that's running. You change the SA password, now that service is broken and nobody knows why. Okay, and that can create havoc, especially if some of these services need to run daily or more than once a day or something like that, and it's bringing pertinent information into your system. So please do not use SA for service accounts or other connections. Okay, power users. So SA is probably the most critical thing that you don't want people to have access to if they don't need to. However, power users are pretty powerful as well, and so you want to be careful when giving the power user role in GP. Now, I know it's really easy to give power user access. It's one click and you don't ever have to hear somebody say, hey, I can't open this window. I can't do my job. Please help me. Oh my gosh, my work is late and I don't know what to do and I can't figure out which window I can't open, right? Because we've all had those calls and I know that's annoying. So it's easy to just say, well, I'll just make you power user and we won't have to worry about that anymore. But you really don't want to. Power user is basically giving people the keys to the GP kingdom. So the way GP security works is in every window that you open, there is a line of code that runs that says check the user's security before you open this window. If they have access to the window, open it. If they don't, return that error message, that pesky little error message that I'm sure we've all seen at one point or another that says, you do not have access to open this window, please contact your security administrator, right? Well, what power user does is it tells GP, ignore that line of code. Don't even look at it. So it's just going to open the window regardless. And with that, then power users do not show in user permission reports. So if your auditor says, hey, I need to know everybody, and this actually happened to me. I'll give you a real life experience. I was doing some SOX work. We were being audited and we had our SOX auditors in. They were doing our IT access audits and I was in charge of getting them a lot of the information. So they came to me and they said, hey, you know what? We need to know who has access to the vendor maintenance window. So I did a quick little query and I said, okay, who's got access to the vendor maintenance window? I looked at, the different users and I handed them a list. And I did not include power users on that list because I didn't know that power users would not show up in that list. I was naive. I didn't know how power user worked. So wouldn't you know, just my luck, okay? This is why I don't gamble because I have terrible luck. The first person that they decided to go and test, because what they did was, okay, we have 8 people that have access to the vendor maintenance. I'm going to go pick somebody that is not on this list and make sure that they can't open this window. The first person they picked was a power user. And as soon as they logged into GP and they clicked on the vendor maintenance window, it opened right up for them. And they didn't trust any word that I said from then on. And I had to spend a lot of time undoing the damage that I had caused by simply not including those power users. And again, it was purely a case of that user should not have had power user. We were in the process of putting some new processes in place. We were trying to automate some things and give access to certain things, and we didn't, in the midst of all the testing and everything, we didn't take the time to adequately design security, and so we took the shortcut and gave that user power user access, and it came back to bite me. Okay, so we want to be very careful. And an excessive number of power users is going to be, absolutely is going to be a sign of poorly designed security, right? Because obviously if everybody is a power user or the majority are power users, you don't have any security designs. So just be careful with that. Orphaned users. Okay, I touched a little bit about them when we talked about user security. Okay, but orphaned users are really, really, really important because oftentimes they serve as a tripwire for auditors to dig deeper in security. I can't tell you how many times when I was doing this, this audit work that the auditors would come in and say, give me a list of all of your GP users. And they'd already gotten a list of all of our Active Directory users and our company employees, etc., from the HR department or wherever they got it from IT, different departments. They were comparing everything. So they were looking not just one source, they were looking at multiple sources. And I had some GP users on there that were no longer with the organization because back then we used a very manual system. So if somebody was termed, I would get an email maybe a couple days after the fact saying, hey, so-and-so was termed, you need to remove their access. And sometimes I wouldn't even get those emails as the GP administrator. So that could be a problem. So we want to make sure that you're actually going through every once in a while, periodically, once a quarter, run a list of your GP users. And if there's anybody who has been terminated, maybe they're out on leave, maybe they've just changed jobs, they're still with the organization, but they serve a different function and they shouldn't have access to GP, set them to inactive if you don't want to delete them. GP 2013 and higher, I believe, has the ability to set them to inactive. If you're on GP 2010 and lower, what you can do if you don't want to delete them is remove all of their security accesses. It's a little bit more involved. It's not as easy as just clicking a checkbox or set or a drop-down field or however it is in GP. You actually do have to go remove all of their roles in all of their companies, but at least they don't have access to anything. Okay, so that notification process is however you need to be notified. Make sure that there's a process in place. Make sure that your IT department knows that if there are any terminations that a notice needs to be sent to the GP admin, whether or not the person had GP access, right? Because they're not going to know. So anytime there's a term, just send an email. I'll figure out if they had GP access or not, and I'll get rid of them. So get some sort of notification process in place. And like I said, if those notifications are coming through, but maybe there's a chance that one has gotten missed somehow, just do your own regular periodic review. It doesn't have to be done monthly. It could be done quarterly, but you're just wanting to do it regularly, especially because, remember, GP users are SQL logins. They are not based on Active Directory. So a user may no longer have access to the network, but that doesn't mean that somebody else can't use that user ID and password to log into GP and wreak some havoc. Or maybe they have a workaround to get into the system another way. Maybe they figured something out and they have some sort of, access via a generic VPN connection or something like that. Now they still have access to GP. Okay, so that's why orphaned users are really, really, really important, and you want to make sure that you're taking care of them. And then when we talk about system access and who has access, all the things that we just talked about, the reason why this is important is because when users have access to the system, they're going to be making changes to the data, and some of those changes may be inappropriate, not just because of malicious intent, but maybe a lack of training. Okay, maybe there's areas of the system that they're just not 100% familiar with and they need some additional training, or they need some additional resources or anything like that. So what we need to know is not just who has access at a very high level, but what they're doing with that access. Okay, so in order to understand what they're doing with that access, again, we want to take a risk-based approach. Okay, we don't need to analyze every single point of access. An average system, including GP, has over 5,000 access points. Let's say you have 20 users. Okay, what's that, 100,000 access points that you could be examining? No, that's crazy. We don't want to do that. There's only about 30 or 40 high-risk access points. Okay, so if you're looking at 30 or 40 high-risk access points at 20 users, you're looking at a maximum of 600 to 800, or I'm sorry, 6,000 to 8,000 different access points versus 100,000. Okay, so when you're looking at, let's say, maybe an audit trail report of some sorts, you could be looking at 500 rows of data versus 1,000,000 rows of data. So let's make sure that we're taking a risk-based approach when we're looking at all of this information. And you want to understand administrative access, like we just talked about, what SA can do, what those power users can do, DynSA, anything like that. And then aside from application security, one of the things that people don't take into consideration is database security. So we talked about users that have access to GP, and then we talked about SA can have access to GP, but they can also have access to SQL. What about your users that can have access to your GP data in SQL, but they don't actually have application access? Maybe you have a DBA that can access your databases, but they're not actually going into the front end of the system. Do you think that they could potentially wreak some havoc? Absolutely. They might do something surreptitiously to actually cause some problems within your environment, and maybe not even using GP. maybe not even using that as leverage. We had a story that we always tell here at FastPath. So we had an enterprising DBA one day that actually had written a trigger on their employer system. Their employer was collecting credit card information for payments for product, and every time the credit card information was entered into the system, that employee would receive a text with a credit card number, expiration date, zip code, and what other element of important information that he needed. So you can imagine what kind of risk this put the organization in, because obviously identity theft and fraud is a huge, huge touchstone, a big area of concern and a big area of focus for auditing companies. And because they are accepting credit card payments, they're putting their PCI compliance at risk. So that could potentially, get them to the point where they're no longer allowed to accept credit card payments, which is a major, major issue, because I don't know how else you would actually accept payments in this day and age. And so things like that. So you want to make sure that you're looking at database security as well. Okay, so keep that in mind. And these are all things that your auditors are going to be looking for. So when we talk about that, your auditors want to know that you guys understand what your processes are, how they work, all the different data points within those processes that are high risk, critical. Okay, we don't care about the little things that aren't critical. We care about the high risk, critical areas, and that you're documenting these processes, that you're reviewing these areas, these high risk areas, and taking a look at them. And one of the tools to allow you to do that is using some sort of an audit trail tool. Now, Dynamics GP in and of itself, out of the box, does not have any kind of audit trail capability at a detailed level. It has activity tracking, which allows you to track changes to master records, but it's only going to tell you, for example, if you want to track changes to vendors, it's only going to tell you that vendor ABC changed on this date by this person. It's not going to tell you the specifics. So it could be something as innocuous as actually just fixing a spelling issue to something as detrimental as changing the remit to address and the check name. Okay, so you might want to investigate a separate audit trail tool and there's several on the market. You might even, consider building them in-house, although it's not highly recommended, only because auditors would like something that's kind of more reliable and proven and has been around for a little bit longer, so that they know that, hey, there's, 100 clients out there using this one tool. They've been on the market for 6 years or whatever, so we can at least guarantee, instead of Jimmy sitting here programming his own audit trail changes. Not saying you can't, I'm just saying that auditors like to rely on more proven methodology every once in a while. But if you're going to use an audit trail tool of any sort, again, and this is something that you hear us say over and over and over, and I know it sounds like a broken record, but you're going to want to take a risk-based approach. You're going to want to focus on key areas, so your high-risk areas. And then even then, you want to focus on key fields. So for example, if we're talking about vendors, you want to focus on maybe payment terms, addresses. If you're talking about items, maybe on the pricing of those items, things like that. So you don't need to audit every single field or every single point in the system, but only those key ones. And any audit trail product, the questions that you need to have that audit trail tool answer is: who changed it, when it was changed, was it changed the right way? So was it changed by somebody who should have changed it? Was it, something that should have been changed? For example, if you're changing a payment term, was it appropriate? If you're changing a credit limit, did you have the authorization to change it? Was it set to an acceptable limit, etc.? And then when you're putting together that information, you need to provide evidence that you're actually reviewing these reports or any other control. So you want to make sure that you're showing that not only are you collecting this information, you're tracking it, but that you're actually reviewing it. I'll give you an interesting story. There was a GP client out there that actually had an audit trail tool. They had it installed, It was tracking data changes. And probably about, I'd say maybe a year and a half after they had installed it and configured it, they called the company that they purchased the audit trail tool from, and they said, hey guys, we need a little bit of help. We need some training, and we really need to start focusing on how to use this audit trail tool correctly. Because even though we had it installed, and even though we had it configured, and even though it's been collecting data for a year and a half, no one bothered to ever review the reports. And so we just finished prosecuting an employee for a $248,000 embezzlement case. Okay? Now, might it have stopped the embezzlement right from the beginning? Maybe not. Okay? Maybe not. Maybe they didn't have adequate segregation of duties. Maybe they couldn't. Would they have caught it before the damage was $248,000? More than likely. Okay? Maybe they still would have had a loss, but maybe that loss would have been $10,000 instead of the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay? So no matter what you choose to do, the key is that you're actually looking at the data. And then one last point, and this is not a Debbie Downer point, and so I'm sorry if it comes across this way, but it is honestly too late to fix significant issues for this year. It's December 20th. There is nothing that you can do today if you don't have any of these processes in place that is going to make your auditors feel better, except to to show them, hey guys, we understand that this is where, we need to put some processes and procedures in place, and this is our plan. Okay, so again, try to be as proactive as possible. Sure, we didn't do it for 2016, but here's our plan for 2017. We're going to go ahead and review all of our access security. We're going to make sure that there's a notification process anytime somebody is termed so we don't have orphaned users. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we don't have a security process that says, hey, if a new user comes on board, just give them access to what John has access to. We're going to have a documented process to say, these are the companies and these are the roles that are being granted. We're going to take a look at the roles that we have in GP and make sure that they're appropriate and we're not still using those CNV roles from years ago. We're going to implement an audit trail module to take a look at these critical areas, and we're going to review those audit trail reports. Okay, so put that plan in action. So while it may be too late right now to fix 2016, you can at least give your auditors the comfort that, hey, you know what, we may have been slacking, but we're on the ball now. We're going to get moving in the right direction, and we're going to go ahead and put these processes in place, and 2017 is going to be an awesome year in terms of controls and compliance for the system. Okay? And then finally, the last thing that we want to talk about is end of year journal entries. And I save this for last because this is really important. It is also one of the high visibility areas for auditors. Okay, so aside from talking about security and controls, when we talk about processes within the system, sure, they're going to look at payables and, they're going to look at, maybe sales transactions, and they're going to test certain transactions and make sure that things look right. But financial journal entries are hugely important for a number of different reasons. Okay, it's a place where stuff can easily get hidden or manipulated, right? And that's because at this time of year, we're doing a lot of cleanup. We're cleaning up accruals. We're cleaning up maybe bad debt accruals or revenue accruals and things like that. We're cleaning up stuff where maybe we amortized an asset wrong. We put it in the wrong category. It was being amortized as whatever for the past 10 months, and it really should have been amortized in this way. Or maybe we didn't run our depreciation properly. Whatever the case may be, right? So there might be a flurry of journal entries. Maybe we're going through and recording, we had all these bonus accruals, and now it's time to actually pay out our year-end bonuses, and so we're going back through and we're reversing all of those things. So this is where you can have a ton of activity, and auditors are really going to pull out that microscope. Okay, so this is a key audit concern. GP offers some limited information, including the posted date, the modified date, the last modified user, the user who posted, and then the optional approved by. This is the GP batch approval information, Okay, this is where if you set up your batches to require approval, this is going to show that. So you can build some journal entry smart lists to pull out this information so that you can start to see, hey, am I seeing posting users here that shouldn't be posting journal entries? Or am I seeing a flurry of activity at like 3 in the morning after our company Christmas party? Am I seeing some kind of like weird kind of things where something is being booked and reversed and booked and reversed and then booked and reversed again, and like, is somebody trying to hide something and bury something amidst this flurry of journal entries, things like that. The other thing that you could be using to help this is optional workflow. Okay, so I think it's in GP 2013 R2, if not GP 2015, when they introduced the journal entry workflow. So you can have approval of journal entries if you activate that workflow, and that is very good, very recommended, because then you have some more documentation on those journal entries and higher visibility, because now it's not just one person that could potentially be posting them, but it's got eyes on it. And then also an auditing tool can be hugely helpful for figuring out who made year-end journal entries and when. Okay, because again, that auditing tool is going to track some of that information that you might not necessarily get. For example, in GP, you really can't track who created the journal entry. It's going to show you who posted it and the last modified user, which if the person who posted it has changed it in any way before they posted it, it's going to be one and the same, but you'll never know who originally created that journal entry. So a auditing tool can be helpful there. Okay, so with that, we have just a few minutes left for questions and answers, but I think I've covered the most critical areas of the system and where the auditors are really going to be focused at this time of year. And hopefully they don't give you too much grief, but please know, rely on your experts at InterDyn to help you through any of the questions that they might have, help you reconfigure your security, etc. And Kim, I'll pass it back to you.
Excellent. Boy, you can feel the passion. This is really fun, something you would get excited about. So again, everybody, if you could write questions that you'd like to ask Liz before we let her go on the right-hand side under the question area. Right now, there are no questions in the queue. So Liz, obviously, we've invited you here as a subject matter expert. And a lot of our customers are feeling, so-so about the security that is built within GP, depending on the types of company, what information they have, and so forth. Can you just spend a couple of minutes just talking about the different fast path solutions that folks could consider as that next bump up?
Sure. So we do offer an entire suite of solutions complementary to Dynamics GP to help kind of take control of your security. We offer Assure, which is our segregation of duties analysis tool that takes a look at your security and has a built-in rule set to analyze your security and tell you where all of your potential risks are. We have an audit trail tool that tracks all changes to critical data, and the differentiator with our audit trail tool and some of the others that are on the market is that we can track changes that happen within Dynamics GP, but also external. So if somebody is logging into your database and changing data at the database level, we'll let you know that. We can also track anything at all that exists in a Microsoft SQL Server environment. So if you have other applications in your organization that are running on SQL, you can use our audit trail tool to audit those applications as well. And then finally, we offer two tools that center more around user provisioning. We have Identity Manager, which is our workflow for creating new users in GP. You can set up some rules based on, maybe who's making the request or what access is being requested, and then it would have to go to one or more users for approval before the security was actually granted in GP, and it would document that entire process. Who made the request, who approved the request, when it was made, when it was approved, and then the security would automatically be set up. And then Config AD, which is our single sign-on tool, allows you to use your Windows authentication in Dynamics GP, but it also allows for things like automatic deletion or deactivation of a GP account if the user is deleted or deactivated in Active Directory. So you don't even have to do that process I was talking about to take care of orphaned users. You can actually have that happen automatically.
Yeah, matter of fact, recently I've seen some conversations about that topic out on GPUG in the community area. So Good thing you've got some of these tools. Well, thank you, Liz, so much. And again, everybody, I really do appreciate this time. It's something, as she said, it is kind of late in the year. Next year, we'll try to plan this a little bit earlier, but put together a plan. It's really, really important. And if you need assistance on doing that, get in touch with us here at InterDyn BMI, and we'll also work with Liz when that solution is needed as well. So thank you, Liz, so much. Great job as
Kim, thank
always.
you. Thank you.